So let's look at Mark 7, 1 to 23. So again, Mark 7, 1 to 23. So let's look at Mark 7, 1 to 23. So it says, "Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions. That they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat and with defiled hands?' He said to them, 'Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.' Then he said to them, 'You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die." But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, "Whatever support you might have had from me is korban," that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this." Then he said the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciple asked him about the parable. He said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, quote, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles, for it is within from the human heart that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. And these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." Now, that's a long passage again. And I know this is probably a difficult passage to make it interesting, right? But I'm going to try, okay? So I entitled this, "The Nonconservative Jesus," okay? Don't judge the sermon by its title, okay? So I'm not talking about politics here. Okay, so the nonconservative Jesus against what? Human tradition. The nonconservative Jesus against what? Human tradition. Now, I chose the title "Non-Conservative" to be intentionally provocative, right? Does that make sense when I said that? I'm intending to provoke something here, certain emotion, certain feeling. Now, we tend to use the term conservative with specific ideas in mind. Usually, we tend to associate it with what? With politics. Okay, but the way I will actually use the term here this morning, I'm going to use it in its general sense. It simply means a conservative is someone who has traditional attitudes or values. Someone who is cautious when it comes to what? Change or innovation. Does that make sense? Or someone who holds on to what? Traditional values, traditional attitudes. Someone who's very cautious about change or innovation. Is that pretty clear? Now, by referring to Jesus as a non-conservative, I am not implying that there's something inherently wrong about being what? A conservative. I'm not saying that. I'm simply pointing out that from the standpoint of his own time, Jesus rejected what? Traditional attitudes, traditional values. That's what he did. And many times we are actually completely unaware of that. Now, he was actually very comfortable with something that is new. He's always comfortable with something that is what? Different. Okay? Now, especially when it comes to God or when it comes to religion. Now, so let me briefly say something about human tradition. What can we say about human tradition? A human tradition is a set of or a system of habits, practices, or beliefs in a particular society that were initially established as mere folkways. This is how we do things. But eventually, at some point, it became what? Authoritatively binding. Now, so from making a claim, oh, this is how we do things, it became what? At some point, it eventually became, this is how we ought to do things. I hope you guys see the transition here, right? So human tradition, that's how it usually starts. It starts as mere folkways, how we tend to do things. Eventually, at some point, it becomes what? This is how we ought to do it. Okay, so it started to have it starts to have authoritative. It becomes authoritatively binding. Okay, now so many times we tend to forget the initial intention for why we ended up with those habits, with those practices. Because at some point it became what? Deeply embedded in our minds. And after it becomes deeply embedded in our minds, we become what? Unconsciously enslaved by those traditions. The reason why I'm talking about this, because this is the one that Jesus will actually attack. Okay? Because what happened is that what was initially just a mere human tradition, at some point it became deeply embedded. It ended up having roots in our minds. And at some point, we began to call it God's commandment after a while. Because through the passage of time, we tend to forget what was the original intent for those practices. Okay? Now, and one thing you have to understand here is this. Ideas are powerful. They can grab a hold of our minds for many years. Right? As a matter of fact, ideas are contagious. Okay? Ideas are what? Contagious. As we live with people in the society, we are conditioned involuntarily, right, to acquire commonly accepted habits, commonly accepted practices, commonly accepted beliefs. They are like viruses. Okay. Some of these ideas, they're like what? Viruses. Now, what do they do to us? They can maim our rational abilities by weakening our perspective by having unwarranted biases, prejudices. They shape or determine our emotional reactions to the habits, practices, and beliefs that are different from ours. And that's the reason why every time a social reformer comes, we get what? Uncomfortable. Do you guys see why I'm talking about this? Okay, because this is what happened to Jesus. There's this human tradition deeply embedded in the minds of the Pharisees and the Jewish people. And then suddenly Jesus came and actually questioning them. Do you guys see the non-conservative Jesus here? Okay. Due to the fact that we are inescapably social creatures, so we can't help but be gripped by human tradition. We can't help that. Eventually, we get what? Gripped by human tradition. Now, social reformers, when you look at Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther King Jr. One thing you realize about them, they always challenge what? The status quo. You guys see the common theme about the social reformers? They always challenge what? The status quo. Okay. Usually, they will have captured audience, and usually the captured audience of the social reformers are those people who were what? Oppressed by the abusiveness of the bearers of human traditions. Usually they are the poor. Usually they are the uneducated. Usually they are the ones who are apathetic about political matters. Usually they are what? I hope I'm making sense here. Usually these are people who are powerless in the society. They are the ones who get, in some sense, they're the victims of some of this, human traditions. Okay. Now, the great social reformers are the ones who always fight for the ideas and principles that in some sense transcend our local needs. They usually fight for principles that actually transcend our what? Relative needs. Usually they address our universal needs as humans. You guys follow me here? When we look at Jesus, he was addressing what? A universal need here. What is the universal need here? That we get enslaved by human tradition. And this is a common human problem. And sometimes when we get enslaved by human tradition, we don't get to see the truth. We don't get to see the truth. That's why when Jesus came, he was trying to what? Destroy. He was trying to dismantle, right? He was trying to uncover the truth by actually what? Challenging all of those human traditions. I hope that that's clear here. So, the Gospel of Mark portrayed a Jesus who is actually a revolutionary social reformer. Sometimes we Christians, that's including myself, okay, at some point we became the supporter of institutionalized power. Do you guys find? Because we became we are the ones, we become the bearer of powers. So sometimes we tend to forget that Jesus was actually a revolutionary, reformative figure, right? Because we are the one who's establishing the status quo now, right? So sometimes we forget that Jesus was actually very different. Okay. Now, so what I'm going to try to do here is look at Jesus here, right, and see some kind of a non-conservative Jesus, someone who was actually going against traditional values, someone who was going against traditional attitudes, someone who is actually very open to what? Changes. Someone who's actually very open to different ways of looking at things. Okay? Now, so let's look at this. So I don't have a good outline today, right? So for some reason I can't figure out how to structure the sermon here. But what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to start by actually I'm going to comment on the text. And then after that, we're going to look at, so what can we learn from that? And then after that, we're going to ask the question, what are the traditions today that are somehow enslaving us? Right. And probably that's a way to apply this, right? To look at those human tradition that we have actually established as if they are commandments of God. And probably this is time to what? Change, right? Okay. Is that clear? Now, so that's what we're going to try to do. Okay. So let's look at the Pharisees first. What are the problem with the Pharisees? Pharisees are portrayed in the Gospels as religious leaders who were concerned with, meticulously observing the laws. They meticulously what? Observe the laws. Okay. They were the ones who were concerned with the minute details of the laws. They were probably, generally like that. I'm not claiming that all Pharisees were like that. Some of them were. Okay. But because we're so familiar with the New Testament, that's why the word Pharisees ended up with what? A negative connotation. So that's why if you look at the dictionary, when it says Pharisaic, right, it means you're legalistic, right? But probably not all Pharisees were like that. But there were probably some who were like that, and they were the ones that Jesus always encountered with, had an encounter with. Now, one thing that these Pharisees failed to see is that the laws are actually justifiably what? Flexible. When your situation change, you can actually what? You can probably change the way you actually read it or read them. But somehow they think that the law should be read in the same way in every single what? Context or every single situation. Okay? They misunderstood the function of the law. The function of the law is to give us guidelines. Okay? But they treated it as if the laws were giving us what? Strict rules. They were so concerned about the letters of the law that they actually failed to actually notice the spirit of the law. They were so concerned about what? The letters of the law, how it is written, right? They want to have a precise understanding of it. But somehow they forgot that what matters is really what? The spirit of the law. Okay? I hope this is clear so far. Okay? So, for example, okay, the laws were supposed... So their tradition involved hand washing. Part of the thing that Pharisees do is that they have to wash their hands first, right, before they actually eat. But what happened is that the disciples of Jesus ate without washing their hands. And so according to the Pharisees, wow, that's wrong, right? You can't be doing that. They were upset because somehow they failed to follow this particular law. Okay? But you have to keep in mind, this law is not really part of God's commandments. But this is some kind of a human tradition, a practice that was started sometime long ago. Probably they were doing that for whatever reason, probably to keep yourself healthy so that you don't get germs, right? But at some point, it became God's commandments. Okay, so they became very strict about this. So the Pharisees are probably the ones who will starve to death if there's no water to wash their hands and they're so hungry and there's lechon, right, or roasted pork right in front of them. Okay, so while all the heathens are actually probably eating it, right, the Pharisees are probably the ones right? They don't eat pork, but I'm assuming, right? So there's some good food, but somehow they will not touch it because there's no water to actually wash their hands. Okay, this is how they were. Okay, what happened here is that they were too petty about observing the law, that they ended up failing to distinguish the commandment of God from human tradition. Now, let me put it this way. Okay, when one fails to distinguish God's commandments from human tradition, one can worship God without necessarily worshiping God. One can perform good deeds without necessarily performing good deeds. Do you guys follow me here? One can serve God without necessarily serving God. Right? One can believe the truth without necessarily believing the truth. One can live for God without necessarily living for God. Right? One can be involved in the so-called work for God without necessarily being involved in the work of God. So the one who fails to distinguish God's commandments from human tradition is the one who is engaged in wasteful commitments or wasteful devotions. I hope you guys are following what Jesus is saying here. I hope that's clear. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, so here's Jesus' response to the Pharisees. What was his response? He responded by appealing to the work of prophet Isaiah. Now, you have to understand, during that time, I think there's some kind of a competition between the prophets and the priests. Okay, I think you see this in the Old Testament. They seem to have two opposing tendencies. The prophets are much more concerned about justice, about love, about care, about concern for people, while the priests are actually much more concerned about ceremonial practices, the laws, right? What should people actually do? How should people do it? So that's what they were concerned. So what you see here between Jesus and the Pharisees are, in some sense, the conflict between the prophetic tradition and the priestly tradition, in some sense. Jesus was the bearer of the prophetic tradition, while the priests were the bearer, while the Pharisees were the ones who were the bearers of some kind of a priestly tradition. I hope you guys are following me here. Now, according to Jesus here, the problem here with the Pharisees is hypocrisy. Say that with me again. Hypocrisy. The problem with the Pharisees is what? Hypocrisy. For Jesus, hypocrisy is the lack of correspondence between what one says and the condition of one's heart. Hypocrisy is the lack of correspondence between what one says and the condition of one's heart, right? We can tell others to refrain from lying while at the same time we are not really lovers of the truth. So, do you guys follow me? We are telling, but the condition of our heart is different. We're not really lovers of the truth. I hope that's clear. We can tell others to not be angry while at the same time we are full of hatred. Now, We can tell others to not worry about tomorrow, while at the same time, we are consumed by our fears about tomorrow due to our lack of faith. We can tell others to be faithful to their spouses, while at the same time, we are consumed by our lust toward another person. Do you guys follow me here? Right? What we say and the condition of our hearts do not correspond with each other. And that's what Jesus referred to as what? Hypocrisy. We are more worried about what comes out of our mouth than the rottenness of our hearts. Right? We are concerned about what comes of our mouth than the rottenness of our hearts. Now, Jesus understood the concerns about lip service, right? But Jesus said, lip service will not do the work. What really matters is what? The condition of one's heart. Because lip service cannot really transform our lives. Lip service cannot really transform our lives. One must be changed from within. And Jesus understood this. Okay. Now, the Pharisees were hypocrites because what they say does not correspond to the what? Their heart. They made it seem that they were concerned with God's commandments, but they were actually merely concerned about human tradition. They were concerned with outward cleanliness, even though they should have been what? Concerned with inward cleanliness. Jesus could discern the conditions of their hearts. Jesus understood that. Just by looking at them, he saw through them, and he saw the condition of what? Of their hearts. I was telling Florence that I probably should change the values of Symposia. If you read our Facebook page, right, I wrote like 6 values. I was thinking probably we should just actually reduce that to 2, right? We will focus on the discipleship of the Christian mind and the cultivation of the Christian heart. After reading this, I was thinking, I think this is what we should do. Okay, are you guys following here? The discipleship of the Christian mind and the cultivation of what? The Christian heart. Because I think this is powerful. All of us will need this, right? It's not just you. I'm referring to myself here too. So because again, you have to understand, even in the mind of Jesus, he thought of teaching as a form of worship. It is a sacred duty, right? It substantively informs our act of worship. Worshipping God based on human tradition rather than God's commandment is in vain. That's why my task my task and Jean's task as teachers in our group here is to actually what? Figure out that we're not teaching you human tradition. We need to figure that out. Because sometimes we can be mistaken that what we're probably telling you is human tradition, and we just assume that it is a commandment from what? From God. Now, Jesus showed the Pharisees that in a subtle way, they rejected God's commandment in favor of what? Human tradition. Now, what happened here? There was actually part of the passage here that I myself had a difficulty trying to figure out what it is about. Remember, Jesus said, you were commanded to honor your parents and not to speak evil of them. But according to Jesus, but you guys are doing something wrong. And the whole time I was trying to figure out what the heck is wrong here, right? What was happening here during that time? So I was trying to figure it out last night, what this passage is about. But I think this is what it is actually about, okay? What happened is that some Jewish teachers thought that honoring your parents is the most important what? Of the law. Honoring your what? Parents. And some of the Jewish interpreters also thought that they also thought that taking care of your parents when they're old is also part of honoring your parents. But what happened is that some of the Jewish people during that time, what they do is this. They have some whatever properties they have, they will actually, in some sense, donate it to the temple, and it will be considered as what? Consecrated. And because it is consecrated to God, they cannot really use it in order to actually what? Support their parents, even if they need to. Because it's already consecrated to God, so that means one cannot what? Touch it. But Jesus was actually telling them, isn't it the case that honoring your parents is actually much more valuable than you observing that human tradition of giving properties for the use of the temple? So when the time comes that your parents will need that, right, you should be able to take it out and actually use it for them. Because what matters is the commandment of God, not human tradition. Do you guys follow me? I think that's how it's supposed to be interpreted, okay? If I'm misleading you here, blame me later on, okay? But I think that's how it's supposed to be interpreted. That's why Jesus was actually telling them. Again, he's not telling them that it's wrong for you to give your properties to the temple. What he's claiming is that you seem to be inconsistent here. You let human tradition, right, have priority over the commandment of God. Which one is much more important? The commandment of God, or is it what? Is it human tradition? Okay. Now, God's commandment to honor and provide for your parents should have priority over the human tradition of consecrating some things, right, for use in God's temple. I hope that's clear. Okay. Now, at some point, this is what happened to us. Mere etiquette, such as washing of hands, right, become authoritative tradition that we ended up treating it as some kind of what? A spiritual duty. But it was just mere what? Mere etiquette or tradition. So for example, in the Philippines, because of patriarchy, for example, right? Certain etiquettes were somehow established. So for example, in the Philippines, I don't know if this is the same thing is true today. Women were considered as bad if you were the one who initiated the move, if you want to date a guy. You guys following me? But actually, there's really nothing wrong about that. Are you guys following me here? Right? I hope the girls will cheer me on this. Right? Okay? There's really nothing wrong about that. But that is just part of what? Human tradition. Because they were actually what? Conditioned to think with this patriarchal mentality. And that's the reason why, I hope you guys are following me here. This is human tradition here, right? Or, for example, I'm assuming, again, I don't know if some of you are like that here, but some husbands, for example, they think that part of the tradition is that only the husband should work. Because husbands must be what? Breadwinners. So they will not let their wives work, right? Even though they really need the money, right? Because they think, but that's just human what? Tradition. That's not a commandment from God. I hope you guys, I'm just trying to relate it to us. I'm not trying to stop you from, from having that kind of view. I'm simply pointing, you just have to understand that's just what? Human tradition. Serve Sabbath day on a different day. I think we were talking about that before, right? So some people will actually make a big deal out of that, right? Not on Sunday. Wow, there's something must be wrong. But again, keep in mind, that's just what? Human tradition. Don't allow human tradition to somehow enslave your minds. Okay, for Jesus, it is not the act that matters. Rather, it is the condition of what? Our hearts. One's motive for the act is what makes the act valuable. One's motive for the act is what makes the act valuable. If I perform an act simply to fulfill an obligation or to impress someone, then I fail to perform it in the way it should be performed. Right? An act should be done out of deep concern for another person. If I'm just trying to do that to be popular, right, or to impress, or to get some what we call in Tagalog, pogi points, right? You guys following? I don't even know how to translate that in English, right? So I'm not sure, right? Say it again. Okay, there you go, right? Okay. Now, so according to Jesus, it is not what you put in your mouth that makes you unclean or evil. It can make you unhealthy, right? But it's not going to make you what? Spiritually unclean. Rather, it is what comes out of one's heart that makes someone what? Unclean. Whatever you put in your mouth will eventually what? Come out. So Jesus criticized the Jewish dietary what? Restrictions here because they were so concerned about the things that they eat, right? It is our evil intentions that make us unclean. It is what? Our evil intentions that makes us unclean. In spiritual matters, the nature of one's intentions has what? Priority over one's act. You know what's more important? It's not the act. It's what? It's the intention, the heart, right? An act can fail to correspond to one's intention, but a good intention can make a seemingly unacceptable act good. You guys follow me here? Remember Robin Hood, right? You guys follow me? He's like stealing money from the rich in order to actually what? Help the poor, right? So he was doing an evil act of stealing money, right? But it was his intention that made him appear to us as what? Heroic. Isn't that weird? Okay, because what matters is like, your intention. Okay? Now, so what can we learn from the text? We're almost done. So I thought it would take me forever to do this. Right? But we're almost done. Okay. So what can we learn from this? So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to read through, I think I have a list of 5 things here that I think we can learn from this. It's not an exhaustive list. You guys can come up with whatever it is that you learn from this message here. But one is this. Learn to distinguish God's commandments from human tradition. Right? For example, there are Christians who fail to love other people due to their love for their own doctrines or theologies. Do you guys follow me here? There are people who fail to love other people, right? Because of their what? Doctrines or theologies. Failing to understand, right, that doctrines and theologies can simply be just what? Human tradition. But you are commanded by God to love. Do you guys follow me here? Right? Be aware of the possibility that widely accepted Christian doctrines or theologies are merely part of what? Human traditions. Secondly, for God, the nature of one's intentions matter more than the nature of one's actions. Do you guys follow me here? For example, a good act is not an end in itself. Rather, a good act is simply a means to fulfill the ends of a good intention. What matters is not really the act, right? The matter is what? The intention. What are you intending to accomplish? Do you guys follow me here? Right? Sometimes we use the act as the end in itself. Oh, as long as I was able to contribute money to the church, I'm okay. Do you guys follow me here? But probably that's not really what matters. What was your intention when you were actually doing that? Do you guys follow me here? Right? Most of the time, we are concerned more with the action without worrying about the nature of our intentions. Be concerned with the intentions behind your actions. Keep in mind that good intentions and its corresponding good actions must always what? Go together. A good action without good intention is simply Pharisaic. You are just like the Pharisees, right? If you perform good deeds without good intentions. I hope I'm making sense here. Okay. Number 3. A long-standing tradition does not necessarily contain what is true. How we usually do something is not necessarily how we ought to do it. Do you guys follow me here? Right. I'm going to try to see if I can skip some of this. Okay. Number 4. An act that simply treats God or another human as mere means rather than as ends is not acceptable to God. We don't treat other humans as what? Means to our ends. Do you guys follow me here? If I'm only being nice to you because you will be supporting Symposia, then I'm actually what? I'm doing an evil thing. Do you guys follow me here? If I'm only going to be nice to you because you're going to help us out here, I am doing an evil thing. I hope that makes sense. Right? I'm not supposed to treat you as a means to my ends. I'm supposed to treat you as an end in what? In yourself. Okay. I'm treating you as a human being just because you are a human being. Right? Yes. Does that make sense? Yes. Because you're just another human being, right? It has nothing to do with whether you can help me out or not. Okay? Number 5, there is nothing necessarily wrong with being revolutionary, being different, or challenging the status quo. We are not called to simply remain passive. We are called to active engagement in bringing about new ideas or probably recovering forgotten ideas. New things do not necessarily mean that they are wrong. Does that make sense? Now, so let me go with my last point. So I'm almost done. I always say that, right? But it takes like, another 5 minutes, right? Okay. Right. So what human tradition that found its way into our churches today that we should oppose as Christians? So this might sound controversial, but I'm going to give you a list of what? 12. Because this is the only things that came to my mind. But I'm assuming there are probably, dozens of this, okay? So number 1, I'm just going to read through them quickly. Overly literal interpretation of the Bible. Okay, that's a tradition. You guys understand, even the people in the New Testament did not read, not all of them read the Bible, literally. They were reading it figuratively, symbolically. So this is some kind of a tradition. Is that clear? Number 2, conflation of our Christian identity and national and familial identity. We tend to conflate, right, our identity as Christian and our identity as a member of a particular political society. So sometimes people will confuse their Christianity with their being Democrats or being Republicans. Do you guys follow me? But keep in mind, that is just human tradition. Do you guys follow me here? That's just human tradition. Do not conflate you being a Christian or you being an American, right? As if as if they're necessarily connected. Do you guys follow me here? Right? Number 3, unquestioning commitment to humanly constructed set of teachings. I'm not asking you to be rebels. Okay? That's not what I'm asking you to do. Right? But this tradition that we should not question, things that we received from people of the past. Right? That can be a bad thing. That's human tradition. Number 4, ritualization of religious practices. Ritualization of what? Religious practices. Now, what do I mean by this? Attending churches, right? Church services and giving money to the church. I should not be saying this because we're trying to start a church, okay? But I have to. Because sometimes we do this, we turn it into a ritual. You guys following me here? We turn it into a ritual. I have to be at church because this is this is a habit that we have, right? I have to give money to the church. Like what I said, I should not be saying this because it looks like I'm gonna. It's gonna be bad for Symposia later on, right? Yeah, I know. But I have to tell you the truth. Does that make sense? We are ritualizing it. Okay. Conflation of how we normally do things in church with how we ought to do things in church. Remember, this is the problem why some churches even got divided because of how they do worship. The older people want hymns, the younger people want contemporary worship service, right? So what happened? The church gets what? Divided because some people thought this is how we always been doing this. We only have the piano. We never use drums. Okay. Do you guys follow me? But that's just human human tradition. Now, the belief in the superiority of men over women. That is also just human tradition, right? Denominationalism is the only game in town. That's just also that we have to be part of a denomination. There are churches that flourish without being part of a denomination. Abundant Living, Water of Life, they flourish without being part of I have nothing against denominations. I love denominations. Do you guys follow me here? But that's just tradition. Now, another thing is that only seminary trained or denominationally ordained people can preach and teach in the church. That is also just tradition. I hope you guys are following me here. Right? A Christian must be a member of a particular political party. That is also tradition. Only member of my group will be saved. That is also tradition. Do you guys follow me here? Only those who pray the sinner's prayer are the ones who will get saved. That is also what? Tradition, right? King James Version is the only acceptable English translation of the Bible. That is also what? Tradition. Do you guys follow me here?
Yes.
You can add more to the list. But if you notice, we are also victims of human what? Human tradition. And when Jesus came, he was encouraging us to what? To set ourselves free from the bondage of what? Human tradition. I hope I'm making sense here. Okay. I'm not trying to offend people here, right? Okay. Jesus was doing the same thing, right?